Super excited today. We have a very special guest. His name is Dr. Howard Hurst, and he's the Senior Lecturer in Sport and Exercise and Nutritional Sciences at UCLan. Welcome to the show, Howard.
Thanks for having me on.
No, it's my pleasure. I've been speaking to Jimmy, who's a mutual friend of ours, and I was super excited to have you on. And I was really curious to see what you could maybe help me with in terms of my nutrition. So just want to start, whereabouts or when did you get started in sciences and nutrition specifically?
Well, I've always been pretty active. I've got quite a varied sporting background. I guess from a competitive perspective, my first main sport was downhill mountain biking. So it's quite a difference between that and where I am now doing endurance sports. So I was fortunate enough to pick up some sponsorships and race that to a reasonable level for a good few years. And then as I started to get older, as we do, I was picking up more and more niggles. It was taking a bit longer to recover from. And I kind of got back into running more as a rehab. And then from that, I kind of just drifted away from racing mountain biking. I mean, I still dabble, and just slowly found myself getting hooked on triathlon and endurance-based sports. And that's kind of where I've been at for the last kind of 10, 15 years. I've been racing that. I was always, I say always, I was lecturing at the same time. So I started at UCLan back in 2005 now, so I've been there quite a while. And it kind of just became almost a logical next step to set up my own consultancy. So for the last 10-ish years, I've been juggling both those careers, having a consultancy and nutrition coaching business, and also doing the senior lecturing and also the research side of things. So
Cool.
It's busy.
Yeah, it's busy. It sounds busy. What's the favorite thing that you like to dig into? Are they equally the same, or tell me about maybe the research part that you love, and then maybe about the consultancy side?
Yeah, I think they both go hand in hand, to be fair. I mean, the research side of things over the last 12, 18 months, we've been doing some work on eating disorders, particularly within the cycling community. And we've got a new paper that's just been accepted, so that should be coming out hopefully within the next month. And that's just exploring eating disorders, disordered eating within competitive cyclists, male and female. And that's quite interesting, some of the comments that came back from that. There seems to be a huge preoccupation with weight, which wasn't particularly a surprise to us, but I think the extent to that and deciding that low weight always equals better performance seems to be quite ingrained within those cyclists. And I dare say it's probably similar in other endurance-based activities. And I think for us as nutritionists and coaches, we need to try and educate athletes that that's not always the case. And I think certainly when you look at the professional level in cycling, I think weight seems to be focused on far too much. And I think, yes, power to weight is important, but I think too often we try to force riders to be the lightest that they can. And really, I think what we should be doing is looking at the individual specialisms, the skill set. So some of the bigger riders, we're better off saying you might be suited to time trialing or going down the rouleur route, things like that, rather than trying to constantly get them to drop as much weight as possible. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in that area, not just with the riders, but with coaching staff and other stakeholders within the sport. But I think what I enjoy about the nutrition side of it and the consultancy side is that education. It never stops surprising me how many athletes I work with who I'll speak to, and the first thing they say, I reckon my diet's pretty nailed on. I'm eating pretty well. And actually, when you start digging into it, I've never met an athlete I've not been able to improve the diet yet. There's always something there that we can tweak to improve. So I kind of enjoy that challenge, I think.
Yeah, I remember seeing Mark Cavendish's Netflix show, and he was very focused on that weight issue, and it actually became a bit of a problem. Just touching on that quickly, what sort of things did you pick up, or what sort of problems? Let's dig a little bit further into that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes from the coaches and say the misunderstanding of a rider's qualities and this almost entrenched idea that we have to be as lean as possible. And I think there's no getting away from that to a degree. Yes, power to weight ratio is very important, but again, going back to what I said before, not everybody's going to be a great climber. Not everybody's going to be a great sprinter. Not everybody's going to be a great time trialist. So we need to try and work with athletes a little bit more and find out what their strengths are. A lot of the comments that came back were just from club members, and just kind of the what you might call a bit of blokey banter. Hey, all right, fat lad, you've been putting it away a bit, haven't you, lately? And just things like that. But that was very triggering for a lot of the cyclists that we interviewed, and little comments like that were enough to stimulate not necessarily full-blown eating disorders, but certainly disordered eating. Okay, so for the listeners who might not be familiar with the difference, it's largely down to the strength of those feelings, how much psychological stress it places on the rider. So I think we all have some traits of disordered eating, picky eating a little bit, and these days it's quite hard to avoid that with all this fad diets, and we're being bombarded by, don't eat this, we should be eating that to an extent. But by and large, that doesn't tend to cause us any real psychological harm. But when that does start to cross over that line and starts to impact on daily life and quality of life, then that becomes more an eating disorder. So there was a lot of little things like that. Females, as we kind of expected, seem to be a little bit more susceptible to this, but not massively. I mean, the male riders that we interviewed were almost equally as susceptible to comments like that. So it was almost the small, innocuous comments that seemed to be having a big effect, which was, I think that was the big surprise for us.
Okay, and so at that point, when there's an emotional or comment, then is that disorder happening that they're not eating enough, and then how does that impact performance?
It certainly impacts on their approach to eating and feeding. Quite often, a lot of the riders reported going on binge diets, trying to rapidly lose weight, so that they could get down to whatever's deemed a desirable weight or an appropriate weight for them. That rarely ever works. We know from years of research that a slower, more controlled approach tends to have longer lasting implications. So, all these crash diets, 5-2 and all that stuff, it doesn't work because people just tend to either overeat on the days that they're eating normally. They've done 2 days of low calorie intake, but then they just overcompensate for that on the days where they can eat normally. It also down to the things that they're eating as well. So, you may get athletes starting to look at diet supplements as an aid to try and lose weight. Or I think one of the big ones that we see at the minute is carbohydrates. And I think a lot of the negative comments around carbohydrates comes from ill-informed media. I think carbohydrates have come in for a lot of bashing. And it seems to be, depending on which social media outlet you look at, it's responsible for every disease under the sun. The reality is we're endurance athletes, and carbohydrates are king. So we need to make sure we've got enough carbs. I think the other problem, and not necessarily maybe from an eating disorder perspective, but just nutrition in general, is protein. There's a huge amount of emphasis in the media again about we should be eating protein. And you go down to your supermarket, everything seems to have the word protein written on it now, like it's this big cure of everything. And it's at the end of the day, protein Mars bar, it's still a Mars bar. Just because it says protein on it doesn't make it any better for you. But that's what people thinks they should be doing. Because that's what they see in the media. Well, it's got to be good for us. But I mean, as an endurance athlete, my comment is always focus on the carbs first. That's carb receptors in the muscles are only receptive for a couple of hours, 6 to 8 hours. Your protein receptors are receptive for about 24 hours. So if you've just been out and done a 4 or 5 hour ride, then the first thing you really should be protecting is replacing the energy that you just burnt. Recovery, okay, we can try and tie the two together, but that recovery process can come a little bit later. We can delay that a little bit if needed. So in an ideal world, we want to try and hit both at the same time, but carbs should be the priority. So there's a lot of misinformation out there. I think there's a lot of people claiming to be nutritionists, and social media doesn't help. Everybody seems to be a nutrition expert on Instagram these days, and unfortunately, people tend to look at these people and go, "Oh, well, they've got a great body; they must know what they're doing," But from our perspective, that's frustrating as nutritionists, because people don't always look for the qualifications, so they're not always getting the best advice.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you touched on it there. Social media and in our supermarkets, there's a massive, I think, increase in terms of protein wording around anything, and a lot of the products and things actually say protein, but it may necessarily not be that high in protein. But just where I wanted to touch on, in rugby, obviously there was a huge protein focus, and it was the other way. Rather than getting leaner, it was more trying to bulk. Myself actually was to bulk up and get bigger. But let's just touch on something that's also popular in the media at the moment, which is plant-based versus meat-based. What's your opinion on the debate, and where do you stand, knowing what you know from a research point of view?
I think one of the arguments that's often leveled at plant-based diets is that you can't get enough protein from that without having to resort to supplements. That's just simply not true. If you have a varied plant-based diet, then you can certainly get the protein requirements that you need. For me, I mean, I have a colleague who works with us, and that's more his area. And they're just doing some research at the minute looking at the effects of vegan versus omnivore diets from a health perspective. And the results are pretty hard to deny. I mean, the positive benefits that it's having on a whole range of health markers and disease, it really took me by surprise. I mean, I was only chatting to him about a fortnight ago, and he's shown me some of the data, and I was like, wow, this is amazing. And when you see the data set out in front of you, I think it's quite difficult to ignore it. Now, I'm not saying we should all go on a vegan diet, and I'm certainly not going to. I like a good steak as much as the next person. But I have started to make some changes. I'd already started making some changes prior to seeing the data from colleagues, but it's certainly got me thinking a little bit more. Should we be cutting back on the meat and the dairy products a little bit? But I think it's important to sort of caveat that with everything in moderation is fine. And again, some of the terms that you see, clean eating and this, that, I hate those terms. It has very negative connotations to certain food groups or certain types of foods, and inherently no food is bad for us. Okay, we can eat everything. what's bad for us is overconsumption. So, yes, I think a switch to partial vegan, if you like meat, is going to do you some good. If you want to go full vegan, that's great. Go for it. It's not going to do you any harm. It's going to do you more good than harm, that's for sure. And as an athlete, you can certainly compete successfully on a vegan diet. I think it just needs a little bit more planning.
Yeah, for sure. Tell me a little bit about the changes you've made.
So I don't tend to eat red meat anymore. That was more so just from a health perspective. Thanks to my parents and grandparents, I have hereditary high cholesterol. So thanks for that, Grandad. So that's one of the joys of getting older. Once you start getting to 50, you have to go for these tests, and they come up with all sorts. Oh, you got this and that. But yeah, my cholesterol was pretty high, despite the exercise, and that's one of the things that the doctors were very clear to say. It doesn't matter how healthy your lifestyle is, if you've got hereditary high cholesterol, the amount of exercise you do is going to have a negligible effect on that. But from a diet perspective, I just tried to cut out some of the red meat. I eat more salads. I'm not a huge salad lover, I'm going to say. I know that's terrible as a nutrition. I know they're good at great food, but tomatoes, cucumbers, not my thing. So I have tried to eat a little bit more varied plant-based food and just generally cut down on the animal products a little bit. Cheese, I could eat cheese like it's going out of fashion. That's probably my big vice. So that has definitely been reduced. And just really doing that, just cutting out some of the dairy a little bit, cutting back on some of the meat. I've seen some big improvements. I've certainly lost some weight. Cholesterol levels have come down. Has it negatively affected my performance? Yeah. So you don't have to have a massive sea change in dietary practices. Just some small changes here and there can have significant impacts.
Yeah, brilliant. So you've noticed a drop in cholesterol and then a drop in weight just from making small micro changes. Is that right?
Yeah, and at the minute, those changes, I can be confident it's not down to exercise because I'm currently injured. So I've not been doing a huge amount of exercise. So it's certainly dietary that's had those impacts. So once I'm recovered and start getting back to training and doing a bit more, then hopefully those improvements should see a big increase.
You mentioned slightly earlier about how you've never been able to improve. You've never not been able to improve an athlete's eating or nutritional routine. Tell me a little bit about that and maybe some stories, what you've seen and how you've changed things.
Yeah, I mean, from a race perspective, first off, I think the biggest mistake I see in athletes that I've worked with is hydration, and predominantly overhydrating rather than underhydrating. And I think one of the challenges there is, particularly when you look at these big city marathons and events like that, by and large, excuse me, most of them are sponsored in some way by a drinks company, a water company, or an energy drink type company. And for anybody who's done well, they'll know when you sign up, you get all this information that comes through. By and large, some of that is nutritional advice. And what they tell you is you've got to keep on top of the hydration. So make sure you're having something at each of the aid stations. But if you take, say, the London Marathon, which was on recently, there's aid stations nearly every kilometre. So if you're taking fluids on at every aid station, by the time you've finished 26 miles, you're going to be waterlogged. So I think that's a massive challenge. But what the big issue there is not so much taking on the water, although that can be problematic. And I think it's important to say that in all these big city marathons, no one's ever died, or there's been no recorded deaths from dehydration. nearly every year there's at least one or two deaths directly attributed to hyperhydration. So, but I think with that overhydrating comes the diluting of sodium levels, so that you start to run the risk of hyponatremia. In its least severe form, that's just could lead to stomach cramps, muscle cramps. But in worst case scenarios, that can lead to cardiac problems and death. And that's where the vast majority of these deaths that have occurred in these big events is due to hyponatremia. Just by making some small changes. I mean, to give you an example, I had a client a couple of years back, and he was doing, I think it was one of the brutal Ironman races, and got off the bike, got onto the run, got about 7 miles into the run, just bombed out, couldn't go any further, stomach cramps, muscle cramps, everything. So he came to me, asked for some advice, and I had a look at what he was doing. And the only thing that changed was his water strategy. His food-wise, yeah, there's some small tweaks that we made there, but not massive. The big one was cutting down on his fluid intake. Now, what he was trying to do, he was trying to take over a litre of fluid every hour, which is a huge amount of water to be taking on. That's two bottles, But he wasn't taking any sodium on with that as well. So we just said, right, I want you to half it, have 500 to 600 mils per hour, and I want you to take some electrolyte supplements. Now, there's a bit of trial and error there as to how much electrolytes, but I think we settled on about 800 milligrams per hour. In his next race, he came 7th. Same event, or same iron distance event, and he went from not finishing to coming 7th. And that was purely just from changing his hydration strategy. And I tend to see that quite frequently. So there's a lot of education there. I think more generally, just from day to day, I think it's the timing of nutrition. So while what we eat is important, when we're eating is equally important. So particularly sort of pre those long training sessions or the events, trying to get that carb loading strategy right. And with the carb loading, sometimes it can seem a little bit counterintuitive because on a general basis, we're saying we need more fiber, we need a broad variety, lots of fruits, lots of veg. But if for 48 hours before a long training session or a race, we're saying the completely opposite. You want simple carbohydrates, cut back on the fruits and veg because you don't want to consume as much fiber because that can cause a lot of gut issues and run the risk of the dreaded runner's trots and things like that. So actually, those 2 days before the race, it is simple food. It's white breads, white pastas, less fibrous type fruits, okay, energy drinks. So it's pretty simple food. So that's often a challenge, getting people to think about the things that may trigger these stomach issues during the race. And I'm not saying going from a healthy to an unhealthy diet, but a simpler diet in those 2 days. Often the amount of people that eat, that they're eating, is less than what they would expect when you actually set it out in front of them and say, by and large, I'll always do a diet diary, a week's-long diet diary with people first. That tells me where they're at, what they're eating, what they're not eating, whether under or over consuming, and from that we can make some recommendations. And again, by and large, I would say most people aren't eating enough. They might think they're eating quite a lot of food, but when you actually set it out in front of them, they're not fueling adequately enough to support those training sessions. Going back to the timing elements, thinking about what type of training sessions you're doing and the focus of those training sessions. So if you've got a longer training session, then we need to start thinking about a little bit more carbohydrate. If it's a lower intensity, more skill-based training session, then we can have slightly lower carb intake. But again, I think sometimes a lot of athletes will just adopt a very similar feeding strategy day to day and not really thinking about those small differences in the training focus and what would optimize those training sessions best.
I know a couple of dads in our Ultra Dad community have commented on about going for a run and immediately needing to go to the loo. So it's quite good that you touched on that. But I'm curious myself. I'm about to run a 50-mile race in a little under 5 weeks, I think it is. And what advice would you give me around? I know you haven't seen my diary or what I'm doing, but how much fluid should I be taking for, say, a 50-mile race? And then what would you recommend in terms of fueling for that race, aside from what you've mentioned already?
I think from the fluid side of things, the first thing to point out is very individual. Um, I had a client about 3 weeks ago who was training for London, and he never took any fluids on during training. So, and he didn't necessarily have any problems with that. That's not recommended. I mean, I would say try and have around 500 mils per hour. But for somebody like that, to try and then get them to take on 500 mils is quite challenging. So we'd have to, maybe meet in the middle ground. Now, I think for him, having no fluids, whilst it didn't necessarily seem to affect him in training, or he didn't have any ill effects from it, I certainly don't think it was helping his performance. And I think we said about 250, 200 to 250 in the end, because he didn't really feel comfortable with taking on a lot of fluids. But just by taking that little bit on, keeps the cells hydrated, helps to get the energy through the gut and into the muscles a little bit more effectively. For ultras, I think first of all, it's a long time that you're going to be out there for. So we need to think about palatability. Over shorter duration events, we can get away with just smashing a couple of gels or energy bars and things like that. But when you start getting upwards of marathon distance, that can become a little bit monotonous, and the stomach can get a little bit sick of that. So trying to include some solid foods in there. So again, just simple foods that you can maybe put in your backpack, your race vest or whatever. That could be something simple as a jam sandwich or a peanut sandwich, or some homemade rice cakes, something like that. Avoid the fibre, as we said before, and then probably try to aim, because it's a longer distance. I would probably go on the upper end of the carbs, so probably around 70 to 80 grams, maybe a little bit more if you can tolerate 90 grams per hour. Okay, so you're getting that energy in, and come towards the end of the race or the back end of the race when you may be starting to feel some effects on the stomach. You've already kind of backloaded a little bit, so it takes a little bit of that stress off the stomach later in the race. And then just, whatever's, I think if you know what the race is offering, then try and get your hands on those in training and practice with those, so that it's not a shock to the system on race day. It's not something new. Again, going back to some of the challenges, I'd say that's another challenge that I tend to see people not training with the fueling strategies prior to the race. And really, we want to be doing that a couple of months before, rather than a couple of weeks or just leaving it till race day. You can have the best training prep in the world, but if you suddenly rock up to your race and they've got a different energy drink or energy bar that you're used to eating, and you start eating those, then it can cause all sorts of havoc, and it can be the difference between completing your race or not finishing at all. So, but yeah, I think ultras are an interesting one. High energy demands. I think the other thing with ultras to be wary of is combining fuel and liquids. Whilst that might seem convenient, you can run the risk of overhydrating or overfueling. You get an energy carbohydrate powder, mix it in your bottle. You're getting 60, 70 grams of carbs, whatever. But then for every 60, 70 grams of carbs, you're also taking on half a litre of fluids. So I like to, for those longer events, split it up. So have your carbs, your gels, your bars, your homemade snacks separate, and then have your water. Now, if it's a hot day, you can stick some electrolyte tabs in there, that's fine. But have the two separately. That way, if you feel like you need to eat more carbs, then you can do without necessarily taking more fluid, or vice versa. If it's a hot day and you need to take on more hydration, you can do that without necessarily taking on more carbs and therefore leading to potential gut issues.
Okay, cool. So you're saying every sort of 30 minutes cycle them in, or is there a longer period to do that?
I tend to try and have a sip every 15, 20 minutes, and then I'll have a little bite of something every 30 to 40 minutes. But again, it's personal preference. What you just want to try and avoid is consuming large amounts in one go. So every 15 to 20 minutes, alternating drinking and fuel is probably not a bad strategy. No, I set a timer on my watch normally just as a prompt, because I think all too often we can get a little bit carried away in the moment, particularly in the early phases of these races where everybody blasts off at the start and you kind of get caught up in the moment. You're trying to keep up with everybody else, and it can become a little bit easy to forget your fueling strategy. But if you've got a watch, something like that, and you can stick an alarm on it, it's a great way just to, got to make sure I take something on now.
Yeah, nice one. I mean, in my last ultra, I practiced a lot with the electrolyte gel, and I tried a few, and a few were really bad on the tummy. But it was more going for the very simple version, and then every 30 minutes alternating between that and food. And the water I was just actually sipping along the way. So I might try and separate those slightly more for the next race. But I've got a few dads in the group, and I've set up a 60-day challenge to help them actually drink more, because what we realized was that they were probably consuming a lot of caffeine in the morning and then a lot of alcohol in the evenings, and they're probably in a huge state of dehydration. Tell us what a regular day for a regular dad might or should be consuming in terms of hydration.
Just get yourself a 2 litre bottle, and just try and sip on that throughout the day. Again, that's one of the changes I've made over the last sort of couple of months, and I do feel way more hydrated, obviously, but just a little bit more alert. The one thing with drinking more as well is because it makes us feel fuller, there's less tendency to go snacking and hitting the fridge. But I think one of the challenges again with hydration is people tend to overdo it. Similar within the races, just on a day-to-day basis, it's either one extreme or the other. They're not drinking anything other than coffee or tea, alcohol, or they're drinking gallons of the stuff. And what we need to remember is for every gram of carbohydrate that you consume, the body produces about 3 to 4 grams of water when it breaks that down. So we don't need to be drinking 3, 4, 5 litres of water every day. 2 litres is more than enough. Okay, factoring in, you might be having your teas and your coffees, milk, fruit juices throughout the day, and even alcohol to an extent, as long as you're not overdoing it. It's still liquid. Obviously, it does dehydrate if you're drinking too much, but as long as you keep on top of everything else, then that's not really a problem. But 2 litres a day, just that should be enough. And keeping it with you. Again, you'll get people who'll get a big bottle or a bottle of water and then just leave it on the desk, and they'll just disappear and do whatever they're doing, and it'll still be on the desk 3 hours later, the same amount of water in it. Just try to get into the habit of carrying it around with you. Okay. Now, obviously, this one's probably not particularly practical to carry around with you all day. But if you've just got a normal sports bottle, just try to get into the habit of filling it up. So a typical sports bottle, aim for about 4 of those a day.
lately there's been a bit of popularity around using electrolytes in the morning. Specifically, some of these big brands that are coming out are saying to have one every morning. What's your view on the use of electrolytes?
I certainly wouldn't say you need to have one first thing in the morning, unless you have some sort of specific need, i.e., you've got a race that day and you just want to get ahead of it. If you've got a good balanced diet, then you should be getting enough sodium, potassium, magnesium, etc. within that diet. That means you don't need to rely on supplements, those electrolyte type supplements, at all, really. Why you would have it first thing in the morning, I'm not too sure. The only thing I can think of there is we do tend to dehydrate a little bit overnight. So, maybe that's the thinking of it. But again, unless you are severely dehydrated overnight, then I wouldn't say you need to take electrolytes first thing in the morning. Just keep it balanced diet, varied diet, normal fluids, and you should be fine.
Picked up the habit of having a pint of water with lemon and then a sprinkle of Himalayan salt. Tell me what your view on that is. Should I be doing it or shouldn't I?
It's not going to do you any harm. I mean, if is it just once a day?
Yeah, so just in the morning, starting the day, this was my thinking, or what I learned was that lemon, even though it's acidic, has an alkaline effect on the body, and then the Himalayan salt is just a little bit of natural electrolyte to help that process.
Yeah, I mean, it's again going back to the last point. Really, it's not going to do you any harm, and getting up and having a pint of water in the morning is a good idea because, yes, we do dehydrate a little bit overnight. But in terms of adding the salts and stuff, again, as long as you've got a good balanced diet, there really shouldn't be any need to add any additional salts to your drinks. There should be enough sodium, potassium, etc. within your foods and within the other drinks that you've been consuming the previous 24 hours. So it's not going to do you any harm. Well, I say that, I guess it depends how much salt you put in it. If it's just the Prince, it's not going to do you any harm. But do you really need it? Probably not. The pint of water alone is probably enough.
Okay, cool. The next question is about the water and the quality of water. Have you come across anything recently or in your research about microplastics, the quality of water that we're consuming in the UK here specifically?
Yes, there are microplastics in the water. There's no denying that. How much of that is actually getting through to us once it's been through treatment plants, I don't know. Is the honest answer to that? I'd have to have a look at that in more detail. But yeah, it's a concern. There's no doubt about that. Should we all be rushing to buy bottled water? Probably not. You've still got microplastics in that. So it's in terms of, if it's a case of avoiding water for fear of the microplastics or drinking the water, I'd still take the water and make sure I was adequately hydrated. Until there's more evidence on that, I would still take that approach.
Nice. So tell us a little bit about the research you're doing at the moment. Are you involved in any current studies or have you just recently finished some?
Nutrition-wise, again, there's the paper with the cyclists that we've just had published, and then we've just finished another one, which is looking at nutrition knowledge in parents and caregivers within academy level football players. We kind of expect that when you're looking at Premier League football clubs, they have nutritionists in place and they have that support there for the athletes. But what support is there for the parents? Because at the end of the day, at that age group, it's the parents or the caregivers that are predominantly responsible for what food those kids eat. What we found, there was very little in place. All but a handful of the top clubs didn't have any support in place for the parents, minimal support for the actual athletes. Within football, academies are categorised 1 to 4. Cat 1 being the highest category, Cat 4 being the lowest, and depending on what category the club is, they have to have certain staff in place, and whether that's on a part-time basis or a full-time basis depends on the category of the club. But even the Cat 1 clubs were you're supposed to have a full-time nutritionist employed. The support for the parents was very minimal. So that in itself is a challenge for young athletes, trying to get them to, one, get educated about what's the right things to be eating, what they should be trying to avoid, but also getting the parents educated, because sometimes what we find, the kids were probably more educated than the parents, because they're getting at least some kind of support at the club. The parents were getting very little, if anything at all. So that was the other nutrition-based paper that we've recently finished.
What advice on the back of that nutrition and football study, what advice would you give to parents? Because I know that there'll be lots of dads listening, and they'll be also thinking about their children and also how they're going to instill healthy habits and healthy eating in their children. Can you tell us a little bit about what advice you would give?
Yeah. I think the first piece of advice would be making sure they're eating enough. One of the things that's come out of a number of different studies over the last couple of years is elite level junior athletes, if that's what we want to call them, are consistently under eating by anywhere between 700 and 1,000 calories a day, which is a huge amount to be under eating. So whenever I've done any work with junior athletes and parents, my first go-to is just make sure they're getting the calories in, first and foremost. We can worry about the quality of those calories to an extent once we've addressed that deficit. Now, that's not to say go out and start eating burgers and hot dogs and things like that. Obviously not. But, I think we can be a little bit more relaxed to begin with, just to get the food in, the calories in, and then we can start looking at what they should be eating. Preparation. I'd say that's the other big piece of advice I could give. I'm not suggesting that we should all start batch cooking our foods on a Sunday afternoon, but having some sort of meal plan there that they can refer to. So rather than coming in from work and going, right, what should we have? We're going to take away because we've nothing prepared, or we'll just get something quick and easy, which tends to be more processed. If there's a meal plan there in place, at least it gives some kind of structure. Now, you might not stick to it rigidly, but at least there's a plan there in place that can be used as a base template. And slow cookers, I think they're one of the best things that you can get for your kitchen. Just get up 10 minutes earlier. If you know what you're having, a casserole or whatever, chili, whack it in that. There's no prep required. Go to work, come back, it's already done. So when the kids are rushing out to training, then, you can put it in a Tupperware tub. They can eat it in the back of the car on the way or whatever. So it just cuts down on that time and just a little bit more forward planning. I think the other challenge with kids is what they're eating at school. As parents, we have very little control over that. We might, send them with a nice packed lunch, but then there's peer pressure there. And, certainly thinking about my kids, is like, oh, I'm not taking a packed lunch, because they'll all think I'm weird. Kids are strange these days. But it's a reality. So, they tend to go to the canteen or whatever, but what are they getting in the canteen? We can only try and educate. And what I always said to the parents, I did some work, used to work with Wigan Athletic Academy a couple of years back, and I'd say to the parents there, try and put the emphasis on my kids to do a bit more work, get them to think about it, go and do a bit of research. Who's the favourite player? Go and have a look what he eats. Or, go and see what Ronaldo's eating or whoever. And that, if they do that, then they tend to invest in it a little bit more. They take a little bit more ownership of their eating. And if it's good enough for Ronaldo, it's good enough for me. Okay, but there are limits to that. They're world-class elite athletes. We shouldn't be copying everything that they're doing, but some of those habits are pretty good to pick up, and the kids tend to look at those and think, well, if he's doing it, I'll do it. Apart from protein bars and things like that.
Yeah. So, say for example, someone that's listening has got a 10-year-old son, and he's highly into sports. Tell us how much should he be consuming in terms of calories, and are there specific types of food? You mentioned carbohydrate already, but is there any sort of quick wins that, say, a dad that's listening or anyone that's listening can implement into the diet immediately?
Okay, so for a 10-year-old, you're probably looking at around 2,500 calories a day. It's a lot more than people think.
Is it less for younger? Like, is there a range? How do you work that out?
So it's generally based on typical height and weight at that age. No, but even kind of 8 years old, you're probably still around 1,800 calories. Okay. Children tend to require more than adults. And when you're certainly starting to get to sort of 12, 13, 14 years of age, depending on the activities that they're doing, that can be as much as 3,500 calories a day. Difference is we've finished growing, although once you start getting to our age, we might start growing in the wrong directions. But that growth period in children is very energy intensive. So we need to ensure that after we've accounted for all the physical activity and general day-to-day activity, there's enough energy left. It's what we call energy availability, to make sure there's enough energy left for that growth and development process. And as I say, that's a very energy intensive process. So we don't need that much because we've kind of gone through that. Unless you're obviously trying to build muscle bulk and things like that, then that's slightly different. But general day-to-day maintenance, we don't need to have that many calories. So in terms of foods and quick hits, it's quite a lot of food to get in. So think about the snacks. You might want to double up on snacks at lunch times and break times. If they're having some sort of wrap, you might want to double wrap it. There's not actually a lot of carbohydrates in like a tortilla wrap, so you might actually want to double wrap it, so 2 wraps with the filling to get a little bit more in. Things that are easy to consume, so little yogurt pouches, little yogurt pots, rice pudding pots. They're all easy to stick in the lunch boxes or sticking in the training bag to be having on the way or post-training, and they're a good way to try and get that carb in. In terms of the protein, by and large, if they've got a decent diet and a varied diet, most children will be getting enough protein, and research has shown athletic kids tend to get more than enough protein, more than the less athletic peers anyway. So we don't need to be thinking about protein shakes and protein bars and supplements. It isn't necessary at that age.
Yeah. What about red meat for younger kids?
Again, similar to adults, really, in moderation. As long as it's not every day, once a week, maybe twice a week at most, is fine. Go for leaner cuts, similar to as adults would. Try to avoid the sugary, salty sauces that go with it. So there's nothing wrong with a casserole or a beef stir fry or a steak with some vegetables, but just try and not have it every day. Once a week is enough. Try and have plenty of fish, oily fish as well, so we're getting enough omega-3s.
Where can we find more about you and your consultancy? Tell us where can we learn a bit more?
Okay, yeah, you can get me at my website, which is www.proformsportscience.co.uk, and if you can contact me through that. You can set up a meeting. We can discuss your needs in more detail. For any of the dads who've got kids and they want to learn a bit more about that, by all means, go and buy my book, which is available on Amazon. So that's if you just look for Nutrition for Junior Athletes, a practical guide for parents and coaches. they'll find that on all good Amazon stores.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you to the listeners for listening in. If you want to find more about Howard, I put a few links in the show notes for you, and also there'll be some information. If you are a dad and you're listening, feel free to check out our free Ultra Dad community. There'll be a link there as well, and there's loads of supportive dads in there who love a challenge, but they also want to be a great dad. So, Howard, thank you very much again for coming on, and I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me, Nick. It's been a pleasure.
Awesome. Thank you.